The ancient stones of Buckingham Palace held secrets that stretched back centuries, but none quite like what would unfold on that foggy Tuesday morning in October. Sarah Mitchell had been planning this moment for 18 months, studying every guard rotation, every security protocol, every blind spot in the most heavily protected residence in Britain. What she hadn't planned for was the one variable that would ultimately seal her fate: the unwavering dedication of Senior Royal Guard James Wellington. Sarah's story began not in the criminal underworld, but in a cramped apartment in East London where she worked as a jewelry appraiser for a small auction house. Her expertise in precious stones and historical artifacts had made her invaluable to her employers, but it had also opened her eyes to the astronomical value of items that sat behind glass cases, seemingly untouchable. The Queen's personal jewelry collection, she had calculated, contained pieces worth over £200 million. More importantly, several pieces were so rarely displayed that their temporary disappearance might go unnoticed for weeks. The plan had crystallized during a public tour of the palace the previous summer. While other tourists snapped photos of the grand staircase and throne room, Sarah's trained eye had catalogued security measures, noted camera angles, and memorized the layout of corridors that led toward the private royal apartments. She had returned 7 more times, always as part of different tour groups, building a mental map that would prove crucial to her scheme. James Wellington, meanwhile, had spent 15 years perfecting his craft as a royal protection officer. At 42, he possessed the sharp instincts that came from protecting some of the world's most high-profile individuals. His colleagues often joked that James could sense trouble before it even knew it was trouble. What they didn't realize was how accurate that assessment would prove to be on this particular morning. The fog that rolled across London that Tuesday was unusually thick, reducing visibility to mere yards in some areas. Sarah had been monitoring weather patterns for months, knowing that such conditions would provide the perfect cover for her approach. She had studied the palace's exterior walls during her reconnaissance missions, identifying a section near the garden where century-old ivy had grown thick enough to provide handholds for someone athletic and determined enough to make the climb. Sarah's preparation had been meticulous. She had spent months learning lock-picking techniques from online tutorials and practicing on increasingly sophisticated mechanisms. Her small frame, barely 5 feet 4, would allow her to navigate spaces that might prove challenging for others. Most importantly, she had acquired detailed blueprints of the palace through a contact who worked in the Historical Preservation Society. Blueprints that showed maintenance tunnels and service corridors that didn't appear on any public documents. The night before her attempt, Sarah had barely slept. She reviewed her plan one final time, checking and rechecking every detail. Her entry point would be through a service window on the ground floor, accessible only during a precise 12-minute window, when the patrol route left that section momentarily unguarded. From there, she would need to navigate 3 corridors, bypass 2 security checkpoints, and reach the private study where several of the Queen's personal jewelry pieces were kept in a reportedly antique safe. James Wellington began his shift that Tuesday morning with the same ritual he had followed for over a decade. He arrived at the palace 45 minutes before his official start time, using those precious minutes to walk the perimeter and get a feel for the day ahead. Something felt different that morning, though. He couldn't immediately identify what it was. The fog certainly created an atmosphere of unease, but his discomfort went deeper than simple weather concerns. During the morning briefing, James listened carefully as his supervisor outlined the day's schedule. The Queen would be in residence, with several meetings planned throughout the afternoon. Security protocols were standard, with no special events or elevated threat levels indicated. Yet James found himself making mental notes about potential vulnerabilities, his instincts telling him to be particularly alert. Sarah's approach to the palace began at precisely 6:47 a.m., during the shift change that created a brief gap in the exterior surveillance pattern she had identified during her months of observation. The fog provided exactly the cover she had hoped for, allowing her to move across the palace grounds without being detected by the thermal imaging cameras that typically monitored the perimeter. The ivy-covered section of wall she had chosen for her entry proved more challenging to climb than she had anticipated during her practice runs. The ancient vines were thicker than they appeared from a distance, and several times her footing slipped on the moisture-slicked leaves. By the time she reached the second-floor level, her hands were scratched and bleeding, but her determination remained unshaken. The service window she had identified as her entry point was exactly where the blueprints had indicated it would be. More importantly, it was unlocked, just as her research into the palace's daily operations had suggested it would be, during the early morning hours when kitchen staff frequently opened it for ventilation. Sarah slipped inside with the fluid grace of someone who had rehearsed this movement countless times in her imagination. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was dramatically different from anything Sarah had experienced during her public tours. The corridors were dimly lit in the early morning hours, and the weight of centuries seemed to press down from the ornate ceiling above. Every footstep, despite her soft-soled shoes, seemed to echo with a resonance that made her acutely aware of her unauthorized presence. James Wellington was conducting his routine morning inspection of the interior security systems when his attention was caught by something unusual on one of the monitoring screens. A brief shadow had moved across a corridor on the second floor in an area where no staff should have been present at that hour. He immediately switched to the camera feed for that section, but the image showed only empty hallway. Most security officers might have dismissed such a fleeting anomaly, attributing it to a trick of light or a technical glitch in the aging camera system. James, however, had learned over his years of service that the smallest irregularities often preceded the most significant security breaches. He made a note of the time and location, then began a systematic review of all camera feeds from the past 10 minutes. Sarah had made it past the first security checkpoint using a technique she had practiced extensively. The motion sensors in the corridor were designed to detect movement at normal walking speed, but they had a brief delay that could be exploited by someone who understood their timing pattern. By moving in short bursts and freezing completely during the sensor's active scanning phase, she managed to traverse the hallway without triggering any alarms. The second checkpoint proved more challenging. Here, the security system included both motion sensors and pressure-sensitive floor panels, a combination that required a more sophisticated approach. Sarah had studied the layout carefully and identified a narrow ledge that ran along the wall, approximately 3 feet above floor level. By pressing herself against the wall and carefully stepping along this architectural feature, she could bypass the floor sensors entirely. James's review of the security footage revealed several anomalies that individually might have seemed insignificant, but collectively painted a disturbing picture. A service window that had been closed in the previous frame was now slightly ajar. A corridor that should have been completely empty showed what appeared to be a shadow moving just at the edge of camera range. Most telling of all, one of the motion sensors had recorded a brief activation that had immediately reset, suggesting something had triggered it, but then moved out of range too quickly for the system to maintain a lock. Rather than immediately sounding a general alarm, which would have created chaos throughout the palace and potentially allowed an intruder to escape in the confusion, James made the tactical decision to investigate personally. He knew the palace layout better than almost anyone, and he understood that a single officer moving quietly might be able to locate and neutralize a threat more effectively than a large-scale security response. Sarah had reached the corridor that led to her ultimate target, the Queen's private study. According to her research, this room contained a safe that held several pieces of the royal jewelry collection, pieces that were rotated periodically but were not part of the more heavily secured crown jewels display. The safe itself was reportedly a 19th-century piece, sophisticated for its era but potentially vulnerable to modern lock-picking techniques. The study door was exactly where her blueprints had indicated, but as Sarah approached it, she heard something that made her freeze in terror. Footsteps. Someone was moving through the palace corridors with the measured pace of authority. Someone who clearly belonged there and was conducting what sounded like a systematic search. James had developed a mental map of where the anomalies had occurred, and he was following a logical path that an intruder might take through the palace. His years of experience had taught him to think like both protector and potential threat, anticipating moves and countermoves in a deadly chess game played out in corridors lined with priceless art and centuries of history. As he moved through the palace, James's training took over completely. Every sense was heightened, every shadow scrutinized, every sound analyzed. He had switched his radio to a discrete channel that would allow him to communicate with security headquarters without alerting anyone else in the palace to the potential threat. The last thing anyone wanted was to cause panic among the royal family or staff members who were beginning to arrive for the day's activities. Sarah realized that her window of opportunity was rapidly closing. The footsteps she could hear were getting closer, and she estimated that she had perhaps minutes before discovery became inevitable. In her original plan, she had allocated 30 minutes for the actual theft, time to carefully open the safe and select the most valuable and easily transportable pieces. Now, she would be lucky to have 10 minutes. The study door handle turned smoothly in her hand, and Sarah felt a moment of elation. She was inside the target room, surrounded by the personal artifacts of one of the world's most famous individuals. Portraits gazed down from the walls. Antique furniture spoke of centuries of power and privilege, and there, exactly where her research had indicated it would be, stood the safe that contained her objective. James's systematic search had brought him to the corridor just outside the Queen's private study. His instincts were screaming that something was wrong, but he still had no concrete evidence of an intrusion. As he approached the study door, however, he noticed something that confirmed his worst fears. The door was slightly ajar when it should have been securely closed and locked. The safe proved more challenging than Sarah had anticipated. Her lock-picking skills, while considerable, had been developed on modern mechanisms. This 19th-century masterpiece required a more delicate touch and a deeper understanding of historical craftsmanship. As precious minutes ticked by, she worked frantically with her tools, knowing that discovery was becoming more likely with each passing second. James positioned himself just outside the study door, listening carefully for any sound from within. What he heard confirmed that an intruder was indeed present, the subtle scratching and clicking sounds of someone working on a lock mechanism. Moving with the stealth that had made him one of the palace's most effective security officers, James prepared to confront whoever had violated the sanctity of the royal residence. Sarah finally felt the safe's ancient mechanism yield to her efforts. The heavy door swung open to reveal velvet-lined compartments containing some of the most exquisite jewelry she had ever seen. Emerald necklaces that had adorned queens for generations, diamond brooches that had witnessed historic events, ruby rings that carried the weight of empire. Her hands trembled as she reached for the most valuable pieces. But even in her excitement, she maintained the discipline to select items based on their portability and the likelihood that their absence might go unnoticed. The moment James heard the safe door open, he knew he could wait no longer. Whoever was inside the study had successfully breached one of the palace's most secure areas and was now in the process of stealing irreplaceable historical artifacts. He burst through the door with the authority and determination that came from 15 years of protecting the royal family, his voice cutting through the morning silence like a blade. Sarah spun around to see a figure in the doorway, someone whose presence meant that her carefully planned escape route was now blocked, and her months of preparation had led to this moment of ultimate confrontation. The jewelry pieces in her hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy, as if they carried not just their material weight, but the full consequence of her choices. She realized that everything that happened in the next few minutes would determine not just her fate, but would become part of the palace's history forever. The fog outside continued to swirl around the ancient walls of Buckingham Palace, but inside, in the Queen's private study, two individuals faced each other across a divide that separated law from lawlessness, duty from desperation, and protection from violation. What neither of them could have anticipated was that this confrontation would unfold in ways that would surprise them both, revealing depths of character and determination that would transform a simple case of attempted theft into something far more complex and compelling. James's training had prepared him for many scenarios, but as he looked at the slight figure before him, clutching priceless jewelry with hands that shook not from fear but from the overwhelming magnitude of what she had attempted, he realized that this case would challenge not just his professional skills but his understanding of human motivation itself. The woman before him was not the hardened criminal he had expected, but someone whose desperation had led her to attempt the impossible against overwhelming odds. Sarah, meanwhile, found herself facing not the faceless authority figure she had imagined, but a man whose presence commanded respect and whose eyes held not just determination, but genuine concern for the consequences that her actions would bring. In that moment, as the reality of her situation became undeniable, she began to understand that her story was far from over, and that the next chapters would be written not by her careful planning, but by choices yet to be made by both herself and the man who now stood between her and any hope of escape. The silence in the Queen's private study stretched between James Wellington and Sarah Mitchell like a taut wire, each second heavy with implications that would ripple far beyond this ornate room. James's hand instinctively moved toward his radio, but something about the woman before him made him pause. Her eyes held not the cold calculation of a professional criminal, but the desperate determination of someone who had reached the end of all other options. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, each one more unlikely than the last. The window behind the desk was too high and too small for a realistic escape attempt. The door through which the guard had entered remained her only viable exit, but he now blocked it completely. Her hands still clutched the emerald necklace and diamond bracelet she had taken from the safe, their combined value enough to solve her problems forever. If only she could find a way out of this impossible situation. James studied the intruder carefully, his trained eye taking in details that would prove crucial in the moments ahead. She was smaller than he had expected, probably in her early 30s, with intelligent eyes that suggested education and planning rather than impulsive desperation. Her clothing was practical rather than fashionable. Dark jeans, soft-soled shoes, and a fitted jacket with multiple pockets that spoke of careful preparation. Most importantly, she appeared to be unarmed, though James knew better than to make assumptions about hidden weapons. The morning light filtering through the study's tall windows cast long shadows across priceless furnishings that had witnessed centuries of royal history. Persian rugs that had once graced the floors of palaces in distant empires lay beneath their feet, while portraits of long-dead monarchs gazed down from gilded frames, silent witnesses to this unprecedented breach of security. The irony was not lost on either James or Sarah that they were having this confrontation surrounded by artifacts that represented the very power and privilege that had driven her to this desperate act. Sarah finally broke the silence, her voice steadier than she felt. She explained that she wasn't a career criminal, that circumstances had pushed her to this point through no choice of her own. Her words tumbled out in a rush, mounting medical bills for her mother's cancer treatment, the auction house where she worked facing bankruptcy and preparing to lay off its staff, the crushing weight of debt that had accumulated despite her best efforts to manage it responsibly. The jewelry in her hands represented not greed, but survival for herself and the woman who had raised her alone after her father's death 20 years earlier. James listened without interruption, his expression remaining professionally neutral even as her story revealed motivations far more complex than he had encountered in most security breaches. His 15 years of experience had taught him to be skeptical of explanations offered by those caught in the act of committing crimes. But something in Sarah's manner suggested that her account, however incomplete, contained more truth than fiction. The genuine emotion in her voice when she spoke of her mother's illness was difficult to fake, and her knowledge of jewelry and historical artifacts suggested exactly the kind of expertise she claimed to possess. The practical realities of their situation began to assert themselves as the morning progressed. Other staff members would soon arrive for their daily duties, and the Queen herself maintained a schedule that would bring her to various parts of the palace throughout the day. James knew that every minute of delay increased the complexity of the situation, and the potential for embarrassing publicity that could damage the royal family's reputation. At the same time, his instincts told him that Sarah Mitchell represented a type of threat that required careful handling rather than standard protocol. Sarah's desperation began to show more clearly as the weight of her predicament sank in. She had spent 18 months planning this operation, studying every detail of palace security and timing her attempt to coincide with what she believed was the optimal moment for success. The failure of her plan meant not just her own arrest and imprisonment, but the collapse of her mother's treatment options and the loss of any hope for their financial survival. The jewelry in her hands felt like anchors dragging her toward a future she had risked everything to avoid. James made a decision that would later be questioned by his supervisors and analyzed by security experts throughout the government. Rather than immediately calling for backup and initiating standard arrest procedures, he chose to continue the conversation, seeking to understand not just what Sarah had done, but why someone with her apparent intelligence and expertise had chosen such a high-risk approach to her problems. His years of experience had taught him that the most dangerous situations often required unconventional solutions. The conversation that followed revealed layers of complexity that neither participant had anticipated. Sarah's expertise in jewelry and historical artifacts became apparent as she spoke knowledgeably about the pieces she had attempted to steal, demonstrating an appreciation for their historical significance that went far beyond their monetary value. She could identify the provenance of individual stones, discuss the craftsmanship techniques used in their settings, and explain their cultural importance in ways that impressed even James, who had received extensive training in protecting such items. James found himself faced with a dilemma that his training had not specifically addressed. Standard protocol called for the immediate arrest and removal of any intruder found within the palace walls, regardless of their motivations or personal circumstances. However, his deeper understanding of security principles suggested that Sarah's case might require a more nuanced approach. Her obvious expertise and desperate circumstances made her both a potential threat and a potential asset, depending on how the situation was handled. Sarah began to realize that her captor was not simply following a predetermined script, but was actively engaging with her situation in ways that suggested possibilities beyond immediate arrest. This recognition sparked a glimmer of hope that perhaps her story was not destined to end in the catastrophic failure she had feared. She began to provide more details about her background, her expertise, and the circumstances that had led her to attempt what she knew was an almost impossible crime. The morning sun climbed higher outside the palace windows, and both James and Sarah became increasingly aware that their unusual negotiation could not continue indefinitely. Other security personnel would soon begin wondering about James's extended absence from his normal patrol routes, and the palace's daily routine would bring staff members and royal family members to areas near the study. The window of opportunity for resolving their situation quietly and discreetly was rapidly closing. James's radio crackled to life with a routine check-in from security headquarters, a reminder that his colleagues were monitoring his activities and would soon expect updates on his status. He responded with carefully neutral language that confirmed his location and status without revealing the extraordinary circumstances he was managing. This brief interaction reminded both participants that their private conversation was taking place within a larger context of institutional responsibilities and legal obligations that could not be ignored indefinitely. Sarah's understanding of her situation evolved as she observed James's careful handling of the radio communication. She began to recognize that he was exercising considerable discretion in how he managed her case, discretion that suggested either professional flexibility or personal sympathy for her circumstances. This recognition led her to provide even more detailed information about her background, including references and documentation that could verify her claims about her expertise and her mother's medical condition. The jewelry pieces in Sarah's hands had become symbols of much more than their material value during their extended conversation. For Sarah, they represented the difference between hope and despair, between her mother's continued treatment and a death sentence delivered through financial impossibility. For James, they represented not just stolen property, but evidence of a security breach that challenged his fundamental understanding of how to protect the royal family while maintaining the human compassion that made such protection meaningful. James began to explore possibilities that existed outside the standard protocols he had been trained to follow. His years of experience had taught him that the most effective security measures often required creative solutions to unexpected problems. Sarah's case presented exactly such a problem. A crime committed by someone whose motivations and capabilities suggested that conventional responses might not serve the broader interests of justice or security. The conversation revealed that Sarah's knowledge of palace security was far more extensive than James had initially realized. Her 18 months of preparation had given her insights into vulnerabilities and operational patterns that could prove valuable to security improvements, provided her information could be obtained through cooperation rather than interrogation. This recognition opened new possibilities for how their encounter might be resolved. Sarah's desperation began to transform into something approaching hope, as she recognized that James was considering alternatives to immediate arrest. She began to articulate possibilities for how her expertise might be redirected toward legitimate purposes, including consultation on security improvements and authentication of historical artifacts through proper channels. Her knowledge of auction houses, collectors, and the broader world of valuable artifacts could potentially serve institutional interests rather than threatening them. James realized that Sarah's case presented an opportunity to address security vulnerabilities that might otherwise remain undetected until exploited by less sympathetic individuals. Her successful penetration of palace defenses, while obviously unacceptable, had revealed weaknesses that needed to be corrected. Her cooperation in identifying and addressing these vulnerabilities could serve security interests more effectively than simple punishment. The morning light streaming through the study windows illuminated portraits of previous monarchs who had faced their own complex decisions about justice, mercy, and the broader interests of the institutions they represented. Neither James nor Sarah was consciously aware of this historical context, but both sensed that their conversation was taking place within a framework of precedents and principles that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. Sarah's expertise became even more apparent as she discussed the specific pieces she had attempted to steal, revealing knowledge of their historical significance that impressed James with its depth and accuracy. She could discuss the political circumstances under which various pieces had been acquired, the artistic movements that influenced their design, and the technical aspects of their craftsmanship, with the authority of someone who had devoted years to studying such artifacts. James found himself reconsidering not just Sarah's case, but his broader understanding of how security threats should be evaluated and addressed. Her combination of desperate circumstances, extensive knowledge, and obvious intelligence suggested that she represented a type of challenge that required responses more sophisticated than standard arrest and prosecution procedures. The possibility of transforming a security threat into a security asset began to seem not just feasible, but potentially advantageous for all parties involved. The jewelry in Sarah's hands seemed to grow heavier as their conversation continued, weighted not just with their material value, but with the symbolic importance of the choice she faced. She could continue to hold them and insist on her original plan, knowing that such insistence would inevitably lead to arrest and imprisonment. Alternatively, she could return them voluntarily and explore the possibilities that James's unconventional approach had opened. As the morning advanced, both participants realized that their unusual negotiation was approaching a critical juncture. The practical necessities of palace operations would soon require a resolution to their situation. One way or another, the choices made in the next few minutes would determine not just Sarah's immediate fate, but the precedent established for how similar situations might be handled in the future. The ancient walls of the Queen's study had witnessed many historic conversations, but few that balanced individual desperation against institutional security with such complexity and nuance. As James and Sarah continued their careful dialogue, both began to understand that they were participants in a situation that would test not just their individual judgment, but their capacity to find solutions that served justice while acknowledging the human realities that had brought them to this extraordinary moment. The delicate balance that had sustained James and Sarah's extraordinary conversation began to shift as external pressures mounted around them. Through the study's tall windows, they could see maintenance staff beginning their daily routines in the palace gardens, a reminder that the sanctuary of their private negotiation would soon be invaded by the practical demands of institutional life. James's radio had remained silent for the past 20 minutes, but both he and Sarah understood that this silence represented borrowed time rather than permanent reprieve. Sarah had been clutching the jewelry for nearly an hour now, and the physical strain was beginning to show in the tension across her shoulders and the slight tremor in her hands. The emerald necklace, with its intricate gold setting and stones that had once adorned Queen Victoria herself, seemed to pulse with historical significance that made her theft attempt feel even more audacious in retrospect. The diamond bracelet, crafted in the early 20th century for Queen Mary, caught the morning light and scattered it across the study's walls in patterns that danced like accusations across the portraits of former monarchs. James had been conducting mental calculations throughout their conversation, weighing the potential consequences of various approaches to Sarah's case. His training emphasized the importance of containing security breaches quickly and definitively, but his experience suggested that Sarah represented a unique type of threat that might require equally unique solutions. The standard approach of immediate arrest and prosecution would certainly satisfy protocol requirements, but it might also waste an opportunity to address systemic vulnerabilities that her successful penetration had revealed. The complexity of Sarah's motivation had become increasingly apparent as their conversation progressed. Her knowledge of the auction house industry had revealed a world where financial pressures routinely forced honest professionals into ethically questionable situations. Auction houses competing for prestigious consignments sometimes overlooked provenance questions that should have disqualified potential sales. Appraisers faced pressure to provide valuations that supported their employers' business interests, rather than reflecting objective market assessments. Even established institutions found themselves making compromises when faced with economic pressures that threatened their survival. And Sarah's personal history, as it emerged through their extended dialogue, painted a picture of someone who had repeatedly chosen the ethical path even when easier alternatives existed. She had turned down opportunities to inflate appraisals that would have earned her significant commissions. She had reported suspected forgeries even when such reports damaged relationships with important clients. She had maintained professional standards that had earned respect within the auction house community, but had also limited her financial opportunities compared to less scrupulous colleagues. The medical documentation that Sarah carried in her jacket provided stark evidence of the financial crisis that had driven her to attempt the impossible. Her mother's cancer treatment required experimental therapies that were not covered by the National Health Service, therapies that cost thousands of pounds per month and offered the only hope for extended survival. The traditional treatments had failed, and time was running out for both medical intervention and financial solutions through conventional means. James found himself confronting questions that his security training had not prepared him to address. How should institutional protection be balanced against individual desperation? When did enforcement of rules serve broader social interests, and when did it simply perpetuate systems that created the desperation that led to rule-breaking in the first place? His role as a royal guard had always seemed straightforward: protect the royal family and their property from all threats. Sarah's case challenged him to consider whether some threats might be symptoms of problems that required solutions beyond simple enforcement. The study around them continued to serve as a silent witness to their unprecedented negotiation. Books that chronicled centuries of British history lined the walls, their leather bindings worn smooth by generations of royal hands. Documents that had shaped the fate of nations rested in carefully controlled storage, while artifacts that represented the wealth and power of empire displayed themselves with casual magnificence that spoke of resources beyond ordinary comprehension. Sarah's expertise in evaluating such items had become even more apparent as she discussed the specific pieces she had attempted to steal. Her analysis went far beyond simple monetary assessment to include historical context, artistic significance, and cultural importance that demonstrated years of serious study. She could identify the specific techniques used in stone cutting, discuss the political circumstances that had led to particular acquisitions, and explain the artistic movements that had influenced design choices with the authority of someone who had devoted her career to such knowledge. This expertise represented both a threat and an opportunity from James's perspective. Sarah's successful penetration of palace security demonstrated capabilities that could potentially be exploited by individuals with less sympathetic motivations. At the same time, her knowledge of auction houses, private collectors, and the broader market for historical artifacts could provide valuable intelligence about potential threats to royal collections from other sources. The question was whether her cooperation could be obtained through means other than the traditional methods of arrest and prosecution. James began to explore the possibility of involving higher authorities in their situation, not for the purpose of escalating Sarah's legal jeopardy, but to consider alternatives that might serve broader institutional interests. His years of service had earned him credibility with supervisors who trusted his judgment in complex situations. If he could present Sarah's case as an opportunity rather than simply a security breach, there might be possibilities for resolution that served everyone's interests more effectively than conventional approaches. Sarah sensed the shift in James's thinking and began to articulate more specific proposals for how her expertise might be redirected toward legitimate purposes. Her knowledge of security vulnerabilities could contribute to improvements that would prevent future breaches. Her understanding of the artifact authentication process could assist in detecting forgeries or stolen items that might be offered through legitimate channels. Her connections within the auction house community could provide intelligence about suspicious activity that might threaten royal collections. The morning sun had risen high enough to fill the study with warm light that illuminated dust motes dancing in air that had been disturbed by their movement. This peaceful scene contrasted sharply with the tension that both participants felt as they realized their conversation was approaching a critical decision point. External pressures that had been held at bay through James's careful management of communications would soon require acknowledgement and response. James's radio crackled again with a request for status update that was more insistent than previous communications. His response bought additional time, but both he and Sarah understood that their window of privacy was rapidly closing. Other security personnel would soon begin wondering about his extended absence from normal patrol routes, and standard procedures would eventually require direct supervisory involvement in his activities. Sarah's desperation began to transform into something approaching determination as she recognized that James was seriously considering alternatives to immediate arrest. She began to provide more detailed information about her background, including references who could verify her professional reputation and documentation of her expertise that could support claims about her potential value as a cooperative resource rather than simply a criminal defendant. The jewelry in her hands had become symbolic of much more than their material value during their extended conversation. For Sarah, they represented the difference between her mother's survival and death, between hope and the complete collapse of everything she had worked to build. For James, they represented not just stolen property, but evidence of human desperation that challenged his understanding of how justice should be administered in situations where conventional responses might not serve broader social interests. James began to consider the possibility of involving members of the royal household staff who had experience with unusual situations requiring discretionary handling. His years of service had revealed that the royal family often dealt with complex issues that required solutions, balancing institutional interests against human compassion. Sarah's case might benefit from evaluation by individuals who had experience navigating such delicate territory. The historical context of their surroundings began to assert itself more strongly as their conversation continued. The study had witnessed countless decisions that balanced competing interests and values, decisions that had shaped the evolution of constitutional monarchy and the role of royal institutions in modern society. Neither James nor Sarah was consciously aware of this historical resonance, but both sensed that their situation was being played out within a framework of precedents and principles that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. Sarah's account of her 18 months of preparation revealed planning capabilities that impressed James with their thoroughness and sophistication. She had studied not just physical security measures, but operational patterns, staff schedules, and institutional procedures with the dedication of someone conducting academic research. This level of preparation suggested capabilities that could potentially serve legitimate security interests if properly redirected. James realized that Sarah's successful penetration of palace defenses provided valuable intelligence about vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed regardless of how her individual case was resolved. Her cooperation in identifying and explaining these vulnerabilities could contribute to security improvements that would prevent future breaches by individuals who might have less sympathetic motivations or more dangerous intentions. The morning light streaming through the windows had shifted angle as time passed, creating new patterns of illumination across furniture and artwork that had remained unchanged for decades. This subtle transformation served as a reminder that their situation was evolving within a temporal framework that would eventually require resolution, regardless of how complex the considerations involved might be. Sarah began to understand that her case had evolved beyond a simple criminal matter into something that touched on broader questions about institutional justice, individual desperation, and the role of mercy in law enforcement. Her willingness to cooperate fully with security improvements and to redirect her expertise toward legitimate purposes represented an alternative to punishment that might serve everyone's interests more effectively than conventional prosecution. James found himself considering possibilities that extended beyond immediate security concerns, to encompass questions about how institutions should respond to individuals whose desperate circumstances led them to commit acts that they would never have contemplated under normal conditions. Sarah's case presented an opportunity to demonstrate that security could be maintained through approaches that acknowledged human complexity, rather than simply applying predetermined penalties for rule violations. The jewelry pieces in Sarah's hand seemed to have acquired additional weight during their conversation, heavy not just with their material value, but with the symbolic importance of the choice they represented, she could continue to hold them and insist on outcomes that her original plan had envisioned, knowing that such insistence would lead inevitably to arrest and imprisonment. Alternatively, she could return them voluntarily and trust that James's unconventional approach might lead to possibilities she had never imagined when she began planning her desperate attempt to save her mother's life. As the morning advanced toward its inevitable conclusion, both participants understood that they were approaching a moment that would define not just Sarah's immediate future, but the precedent established for how similar situations might be handled by future security personnel facing comparable dilemmas. The ancient walls of the Queen's study had witnessed many historic conversations, but few that balanced individual desperation against institutional security with such complexity and potential for innovative resolution. The moment of truth arrived when James's radio delivered a message that changed everything. His supervisor's voice, tinged with urgency, informed him that routine security sweeps had detected anomalies that required immediate investigation. Other guards were being dispatched to conduct systematic searches of areas where irregularities had been noted. James realized that their private negotiation had reached its natural conclusion, and whatever resolution they achieved would need to happen within the next few minutes. Sarah heard the radio transmission and understood its implications immediately. The window of opportunity that had allowed their extraordinary conversation was about to close permanently. Whatever choice she made about the jewelry in her hands would need to be made now, with full knowledge that her decision would determine not just her own fate, but possibly set a precedent for how similar situations might be handled in the future. The weight of that responsibility felt almost as heavy as the precious stones she clutched. James faced a decision that would define his entire career in royal protection. He could follow standard protocol, arrest Sarah immediately, and process her case through conventional channels that would satisfy all institutional requirements and protect his own professional standing. Alternatively, he could trust his instincts about her character and circumstances, taking a calculated risk that might serve broader interests of justice and security more effectively than rigid adherence to established procedures. The conversation that followed was unlike anything either participant had experienced before. James explained that he believed Sarah's account of her circumstances and motivations, and that he recognized her expertise as potentially valuable for improving palace security. However, he also made clear that any alternative to standard arrest procedures would require her complete cooperation and commitment to redirecting her capabilities toward legitimate purposes. The jewelry would need to be returned immediately, and she would need to provide full disclosure about her methods and the security vulnerabilities she had exploited. Sarah's response revealed the depth of her desperation and the genuineness of her commitment to her mother's welfare. She explained that she had never intended to keep the jewelry permanently, only to use it as collateral for loans that would finance her mother's treatment, with the intention of eventually finding ways to return the pieces once her financial situation stabilized. This admission demonstrated both the naivety of her original plan and the sincerity of her motivation to help rather than simply enrich herself. James recognized that Sarah's account, while touching, did not change the fundamental facts of her situation. She had committed serious crimes that could not be ignored or excused, regardless of her motivations. However, her cooperation in identifying security vulnerabilities and her potential contribution to preventing future breaches might justify approaches that served institutional interests more effectively than simple punishment. The challenge was finding a resolution that satisfied legal requirements while acknowledging the unique circumstances of her case. The jewelry pieces were carefully returned to their proper places in the safe, each one handled with the reverence appropriate to artifacts that had witnessed centuries of royal history. As Sarah placed the emerald necklace back in its velvet-lined compartment, she felt not just the loss of her hoped-for solution to her financial crisis, but also a strange sense of relief that her 18 months of planning and preparation had not ultimately resulted in the permanent loss of irreplaceable historical treasures. James immediately contacted his supervisor to report the security breach and request guidance on handling an unusual situation that involved an intruder who had cooperated fully and provided valuable intelligence about system vulnerabilities. His years of exemplary service earned him the credibility needed to ensure that his recommendations would be taken seriously, even when they involved departures from standard procedures that might seem questionable to those unfamiliar with the specific circumstances involved. The response from Palace Security Headquarters was swift and decisive. Senior officials who had decades of experience managing complex situations involving the royal family understood that some cases required flexibility and discretion that went beyond rigid adherence to predetermined protocols. Sarah's cooperation, expertise, and the intelligence she could provide about security vulnerabilities were recognized as potentially valuable assets that justified careful consideration of alternatives to standard prosecution procedures. Sarah found herself escorted not to a detention facility, but to a secure conference room within the palace, where she was interviewed by security specialists, legal advisors, and experts in historical artifact protection. The questioning was thorough but respectful, focused on understanding both her methods and her potential contribution to improving security measures. Her detailed knowledge of auction house operations, private collector networks, and authentication procedures proved immediately valuable for identifying potential threats that had not previously been fully appreciated. The formal resolution of Sarah's case took several weeks to finalize, involving consultations with legal experts, security analysts, and even members of the royal household staff who had experience managing unusual situations requiring discretionary handling. The precedent established would influence how similar cases might be handled in the future, balancing the need for strict security enforcement against recognition that some violations might be better addressed through cooperation than punishment. James's role in managing the situation was recognized as exemplary by his supervisors, who understood that his unconventional approach had served institutional interests more effectively than rigid adherence to standard procedures would have accomplished. His ability to recognize Sarah's potential value as a cooperative resource, rather than simply treating her as a criminal threat, demonstrated the kind of sophisticated judgment that made him invaluable for protecting the royal family in an increasingly complex world. Sarah's expertise was formally engaged through arrangements that allowed her to contribute to security improvements while addressing her financial crisis through legitimate means. Her knowledge of auction house operations proved valuable for identifying potential threats to royal collections, while her understanding of authentication procedures helped improve systems for detecting forgeries and stolen items that might be offered through ostensibly legitimate channels. Most importantly, her detailed analysis of the security vulnerabilities she had exploited led to improvements that significantly enhanced protection for the palace and its priceless contents. The medical treatment that Sarah's mother required was arranged through discretionary funds that recognized her daughter's contribution to improving royal security, though the source of this assistance was never publicly acknowledged. The experimental therapies that the National Health Service could not provide became available through private arrangements that preserved both Sarah's dignity and the confidentiality that royal institutions required for their operational security. James continued his career in royal protection with enhanced reputation and responsibilities that reflected the confidence his supervisors had developed in his judgment during complex situations. His handling of Sarah's case became a model for how security personnel might address unusual threats that required responses more sophisticated than standard arrest and prosecution procedures. The precedent established influenced training programs and operational guidelines for years afterward. Sarah's transformation from desperate criminal to valued security consultant demonstrated the potential for innovative approaches to law enforcement that recognized human complexity while maintaining institutional security. Her case became a confidential study within royal protection services, illustrating how cooperation could sometimes serve justice more effectively than punishment, particularly when dealing with individuals whose violations stemmed from desperate circumstances rather than criminal intent. The security improvements that resulted from Sarah's cooperation prevented several subsequent attempts to breach palace defenses, validating James's initial assessment that her case represented an opportunity rather than simply a threat. Vulnerabilities that she had exploited were systematically addressed, while her ongoing consultation helped identify potential threats from other sources within the auction house and private collector communities. The Queen's private study, where their extraordinary negotiation had taken place, was enhanced with additional security measures that reflected lessons learned from Sarah's successful penetration of previous defenses. The safe that had contained the jewelry she attempted to steal was replaced with modern systems that maintained the room's historical character while providing protection against contemporary threats that earlier generations of security planners could never have imagined. Years later, both James and Sarah would reflect on their encounter as a defining moment in their respective careers, demonstrating how individual choices in crisis situations could influence outcomes far beyond their immediate circumstances. Their story became part of the institutional memory of Royal Protection Services, though the specific details remained classified to protect both the security measures involved and the privacy of the individuals whose lives had been transformed by that foggy Tuesday morning in October. The broader implications of their case extended beyond royal security to influence discussions about how law enforcement institutions should balance strict rule enforcement against recognition of human complexity and individual circumstances. Sarah's case demonstrated that some violations might be better addressed through cooperation than punishment, particularly when the individuals involved possessed expertise that could contribute to preventing future threats from less sympathetic sources. The jewelry that Sarah had attempted to steal remained in the Queen's collection, continuing to serve their historical role as symbols of royal heritage and constitutional continuity. However, they also acquired additional significance as reminders of how individual desperation could challenge institutional security in ways that required responses, balancing enforcement with compassion, justice with mercy, and protection with understanding. The morning fog that had provided cover for Sarah's approach to the palace eventually lifted, revealing a London transformed by the encounter between a desperate woman and a dedicated guard who had found ways to serve justice that neither had imagined when their confrontation began. Their story became part of the hidden history of royal institutions, demonstrating how extraordinary circumstances could lead to innovative solutions that served everyone's interests more effectively than rigid adherence to predetermined procedures. James Wellington and Sarah Mitchell had each entered that study as individuals defined by their respective roles and circumstances. They emerged as participants in a resolution that demonstrated the potential for human judgment to transcend institutional limitations, creating possibilities for justice that acknowledged both the need for security and the reality of human desperation. Their encounter became a testament to the power of discretion, cooperation, and innovative thinking in addressing complex problems that defied simple solutions. 5 years after that transformative October morning, the ripple effects of James Wellington and Sarah Mitchell's encounter continued to shape both their lives and the institutions they had served in such unexpected ways. The palace security protocols that had been revised based on Sarah's insights had successfully prevented 17 separate attempted breaches, each one detected and neutralized before reaching the level of threat that her own attempt had achieved. The improvements went far beyond simple technological upgrades to encompass comprehensive changes in how security personnel were trained to recognize and respond to unusual threats. Sarah's mother had not only survived the cancer that had driven her daughter to such desperate measures, but had thrived during 5 additional years that the experimental treatments had made possible. The remission that began during her first year of specialized therapy had continued, allowing her to witness her daughter's transformation from desperate criminal to respected security consultant. She never learned the true source of the funding that had made her treatment possible, believing instead that Sarah's expertise in auction house operations had led to consulting opportunities with private collectors who valued her authentication skills. James's career had evolved in directions he could never have anticipated when he first confronted an intruder in the Queen's private study. His demonstrated ability to handle complex situations requiring judgment beyond standard procedures had led to assignments involving protection for visiting foreign dignitaries, coordination with international security agencies, and development of training programs for personnel facing similar challenges. His approach to Sarah's case had become a model studied by security professionals throughout the Commonwealth nations. The formal relationship between Sarah and the Royal Protection Services had evolved into something unprecedented in the institution's history. Her official title, Senior Consultant for Artifact Authentication and Security Assessment, obscured the remarkable journey that had brought her from attempted thief to valued advisor. Her weekly briefings for security personnel covered emerging threats from art theft networks, suspicious activity in auction houses, and intelligence gathered from her maintained connections within the international collector community. The Queen herself had been briefed on the general circumstances of Sarah's case, though the specific details remained classified at levels that protected both operational security and individual privacy. Her Majesty's response to the situation had reflected the wisdom accumulated through decades of balancing institutional requirements against human compassion, approving the unconventional resolution while ensuring that appropriate safeguards were maintained to prevent abuse of such discretionary arrangements. Sarah's expertise had proven valuable far beyond the immediate security improvements her case had generated. Her analysis of authentication procedures had led to the detection of 3 sophisticated forgery operations that were attempting to infiltrate legitimate auction houses with replicas of items stolen from various royal collections throughout Europe. Her knowledge of collector networks had provided intelligence that assisted law enforcement agencies in recovering artifacts stolen from museums and private collections across multiple countries. The study where their encounter had taken place had become something of a shrine within palace security circles, though this significance was never formally acknowledged or documented. New security personnel were often assigned to patrol duties that included that corridor as part of their introduction to the complexities they might face in protecting royal institutions. The room itself had been enhanced with security measures that reflected lessons learned from Sarah's successful penetration, while maintaining the historical character that made it an appropriate setting for the Queen's personal use. James's family had never learned the complete details of the case that had transformed his career, understanding only that he had handled a complex security situation with exceptional skill and judgment. His wife had noticed the change in his approach to his work, observing that he seemed more thoughtful about the human dimensions of security challenges and less inclined to view situations in simple terms of right and wrong, legal and illegal. His children had grown up with a father whose work carried responsibilities they could not fully understand, but whose commitment to justice they could clearly observe. Sarah's transformation from desperate criminal to respected consultant had required years of careful integration into legitimate professional networks. Her reputation within the auction house community had been rebuilt through demonstrated expertise and ethical behavior that gradually overcame the suspicion that inevitably surrounded someone whose background included periods of questionable activity. Her specialization in detecting forged historical artifacts had made her invaluable to institutions seeking to verify the authenticity of potential acquisitions. The broader implications of their case had influenced policy discussions within law enforcement agencies throughout the United Kingdom and beyond. The precedent established by Sarah's case had been studied by criminal justice experts seeking to understand how cooperation might be encouraged in situations where traditional prosecution approaches might not serve broader social interests. The balance achieved between accountability and mercy had become a model for addressing complex cases involving individuals whose violations stemmed from desperate circumstances rather than criminal intent. The medical breakthrough that had saved Sarah's mother had been made possible not just by the funding that her daughter's cooperation had indirectly generated, but by the psychological relief that had come from the resolution of their financial crisis. Stress-related factors that had complicated her treatment had been eliminated when the experimental therapies became available, allowing her immune system to respond more effectively to the sophisticated interventions that conventional treatments had not provided. James's approach to training new security personnel had been influenced profoundly by his experience with Sarah's case. His programs emphasized the importance of understanding human motivations behind security threats, recognizing that effective protection required responses calibrated to the specific circumstances involved, rather than rigid application of predetermined procedures. His trainees learned to balance institutional security requirements against recognition that some violations might be better addressed through cooperation than punishment. Sarah's ongoing work with Royal Protection Services had revealed the extent to which royal collections were targeted by sophisticated criminal networks that operated across international boundaries. Her intelligence gathering had contributed to coordinated law enforcement operations that had dismantled several major art theft rings, recovering artifacts worth millions of pounds and preventing countless additional thefts that had been planned using methods similar to those she had originally employed. The relationship that had developed between James and Sarah over the years of her consultation work had evolved into something resembling friendship, though both maintained the professional boundaries appropriate to their respective roles. Their monthly briefing sessions often included discussions about the broader implications of security challenges, the evolution of threats to cultural heritage, and the complex balance between protection and accessibility that royal institutions needed to maintain. The security improvements implemented after Sarah's case had been tested repeatedly by attempted breaches that demonstrated both the effectiveness of the enhanced measures and the ongoing nature of threats to royal collections. Several attempts had been detected at early stages that would have gone unnoticed under previous systems, while others had been prevented entirely through intelligence provided by Sarah's network within the collector and auction house communities. The Queen's private study had acquired additional historical significance through its role in the unconventional resolution of Sarah's case, though this significance remained known only to a small number of individuals with appropriate security clearances. The room continued to serve its intended purpose as a private workspace for Her Majesty, but it also represented the possibility for institutional flexibility in addressing complex challenges that defied simple solutions. James's reputation within Royal Protection Services had been enhanced not just by his handling of Sarah's case, but by his subsequent application of the lessons learned from their encounter. His ability to recognize potential threats that required unconventional responses had prevented several situations that could have escalated into major security breaches if handled through standard procedures. His judgment had become trusted by supervisors who understood that complex problems sometimes required equally complex solutions. Sarah's mother had used her extended years of life to witness not just her daughter's professional success, but also her personal growth through experiences that had tested and ultimately strengthened her character. The crisis that had driven Sarah to attempt the impossible had ultimately led to opportunities for service and contribution that had given deeper meaning to her expertise in historical artifacts and authentication procedures. The jewelry that Sarah had attempted to steal remained in the Queen's collection, continuing to serve their historical role while carrying the additional significance of having been at the center of a case that had challenged and ultimately improved institutional approaches to justice and security. The emerald necklace and diamond bracelet had become symbols not just of royal heritage, but of the possibility for redemption and cooperation in situations where traditional approaches might have failed to serve anyone's interests effectively. The morning fog that had provided cover for Sarah's original approach to the palace had long since lifted, but the clarity that had emerged from their encounter continued to illuminate approaches to complex security challenges that balanced protection with understanding, enforcement with mercy, and institutional requirements with human compassion. Their story had become part of the hidden history of royal institutions, demonstrating how extraordinary circumstances could lead to innovative solutions that served everyone's interests more effectively than rigid adherence to predetermined procedures. James Wellington and Sarah Mitchell had each entered that study 5 years earlier as individuals constrained by their circumstances and defined by their respective roles. They had emerged as participants in a resolution that had demonstrated the potential for human judgment to transcend institutional limitations, creating possibilities for justice that acknowledged both the need for security and the reality of human complexity. Their encounter had become a testament to the power of discretion, cooperation, and innovative thinking in addressing challenges that would continue to test institutions charged with protecting cultural heritage while maintaining the human values that made such protection meaningful. The legacy of their extraordinary morning would continue to influence approaches to security and justice for generations to come, proving that sometimes the most effective protection comes not from rigid enforcement of rules, but from the wisdom to recognize when rules must be applied with understanding, compassion, and appreciation for the complex circumstances that drive human behavior in times of desperate need.